When Richard and Emily Hawthorne bought the house in Blanco, Texas, they had no idea who had lived there before. It was an old, sprawling home, built in the 1930s, with wide porches and a second floor that overlooked acres of quiet, wind-blown fields. The real estate agent had mentioned, almost in passing, that the previous owner was someone in the film industry, but the name never came up in the paperwork. For Richard, a journalist transitioning into remote freelance work, and Emily, an artist who had long dreamed of a private studio away from the city, the house seemed perfect. It was large but not overwhelming, old but not falling apart, the kind of place that held stories in its bones. The first few weeks were spent unpacking, repainting, and making the house their own. Emily set up her studio in a sunlit room on the second floor, overlooking the fields. Richard converted a small study downstairs into his writing space. Everything felt fresh, new, like a chance to begin again. But then, little things started happening. It was Emily who noticed it first. A shadow in the hallway when no one else was home. A faint humming sound in the middle of the night. The sensation of movement behind her, as if someone had just walked past, though she was alone. At first, she dismissed it, an old house settling, the mind playing tricks. One night, as she stood in the upstairs hallway, she heard it clearly. A voice. A woman's voice. Faint, almost whispering, as if coming from inside the walls. She turned, expecting to see Richard, but the hallway was empty. And then she heard it again. "Don't let them see you." Her breath caught in her throat. "Richard?" she called, her voice unsteady. From downstairs, his voice came back immediately. "What?" Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't tell him about the voice that night. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind slipping through old wooden beams. That's what she told herself. That's what she wanted to believe. But deep down, something had changed. The house was no longer just theirs. Emily tried to ignore it. She told herself that old houses made noises, that the wind carried strange sounds, that exhaustion played tricks on the mind. But deep inside, something gnawed at her, an unshakable sense that she was being watched. During the day, the house was warm with the scent of fresh paint and sawdust from the minor renovations they were doing. Sunlight pooled through the high windows, catching dust motes in slow, swirling dances. It looked normal, lived in, safe. But at night, the house changed. The humming sound she had noticed before became more distinct, like someone murmuring just beneath the threshold of comprehension. She would wake in the darkness, pulse hammering in her ears, certain that someone was standing at the foot of the bed. But when her eyes adjusted, there was nothing there. Just the dim outline of the dresser, the heavy curtains rustling slightly, as if moved by an unseen breath. One evening, while Richard was still in town picking up groceries, Emily found herself painting in her upstairs studio, trying to distract herself. Her hands moved on autopilot, brush gliding over canvas. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just the sensation of the paint, the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. And then, something in the room shifted. It was subtle at first. The temperature dropped just enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. The smell of the paint thinned, replaced by something else. Something stale, old. She set down the brush and turned, expecting to see nothing. But in the reflection of the window, she saw a figure standing in the hallway behind her. It was a woman, tall, thin. Her silhouette was elongated by the dim evening light, her long hair loose and tangled. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She spun around. The hallway was empty. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For a long moment, she simply stood there, gripping the edges of the easel as if anchoring herself to something real. Then, shakily, she stepped forward, peering into the dim corridor beyond the studio. No one. Only the old wooden floorboards stretching toward the stairwell, the soft whisper of the wind through the cracks in the window frames. She exhaled slowly. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. But as she turned back into the room, she noticed the painting she had been working on. She hadn't been paying attention to what she was creating, letting her hands move instinctively, without planning. Now, staring at it, an icy weight settled in her chest. It was a face. A woman's face, partially obscured, as if peering out from behind a door. Her eyes were wide, dark, filled with something unreadable, something between fear and warning. The brushstrokes were rough, frantic. Emily didn't remember painting it like that. A shiver ran through her. She turned the canvas away, face down against the wall, and left the room, flicking the light off as she went. She told herself she wouldn't sleep that night with the thought of it lingering in her mind. But sleep came anyway, pulling her into restless, uneasy dreams. And when she woke, sometime in the deep hours of the night, she realized something chilling. The humming sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the room upstairs, the room where she had left the painting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The darkness in the house felt thicker now, like something unseen had seeped into the walls, settling into the spaces between breath and silence. Emily lay awake, her body stiff beneath the weight of the blankets, listening. The humming was faint, barely more than a vibration in the air, but it was there, threading through the wooden beams, slipping through the floorboards. She turned her head toward the bedroom door. The hallway beyond was swallowed in shadow, but she felt it, a presence. A pull. Richard stirred beside her, but he didn't wake. Slowly, Emily sat up, her breath coming shallow and uneven. The house was so quiet that she could hear the faint creak of wood as she moved. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the frantic drumming of her pulse. The humming continued. It was coming from upstairs, from the studio. The thought of stepping into the hallway made her stomach twist, but the idea of staying in bed, pretending she didn't hear it, was somehow worse. Sliding her feet to the floor, she stood, wincing at the way the old boards groaned beneath her weight. The air in the room was cool, but the moment she stepped into the hallway, it turned cold. A damp, stale cold, like the breath of a room that had been sealed for too long. She moved carefully, the darkness pressing against her. The stairs loomed ahead, disappearing into the void of the second floor. The humming grew clearer as she climbed, low and rhythmic, like someone whispering a lullaby just out of reach. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors. Her studio was at the end, its door slightly ajar. A thin strip of moonlight spilled through the opening, pale against the wooden floor. She took a step forward. The humming stopped. A deep, unnatural silence pressed against her ears. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her mouth was dry, her skin tight with cold. Something in her begged her to turn back, to pretend she had never woken up, to slip under the blankets beside Richard and let the darkness take care of itself. But she didn't. She pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The easel stood in the center, the overturned canvas still leaning against the wall. The air smelled faintly of oil paint and something else, something old. Dust maybe. Or decay. She stepped inside. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the canvas. She didn't want to see it again. Didn't want to look into that half-formed face and feel its gaze pressing against her. But some awful, irresistible pull forced her to turn it over. The painting had changed. The woman's face was clearer now. Still shadowed, still obscured by the edge of a door, but more distinct. The eyes were deeper, darker, filled with something that sent a cold sliver of fear through Emily's chest. And the worst part, the door she was peering out from was unmistakable. It was the studio door. Emily's throat tightened. The brushstrokes were hurried, desperate, like the hand that had painted them had been shaking. Had she done this? Had she come up here in her sleep? The thought made her stomach turn. She took a step back, heart hammering against her ribs. And then, a creak. Behind her, the hallway. She spun so fast that her vision blurred. The door to the studio was open. But hadn't she pushed it all the way? Hadn't she? A shadow passed just beyond the threshold. Emily's breath stopped. It was there. Something was standing just outside the room. She couldn't see it, couldn't make out a shape, but she felt it, an overwhelming presence, like the air had thickened, pressing against her skin. For a long, frozen moment, she stood paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The silence was absolute. And then, from the hallway, a whisper. "Don't let them see you." A chill spread through her bones. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She shoved the painting away, bolting from the studio, nearly tripping over her own feet as she stumbled down the stairs. The house stretched and groaned around her, the wood whispering beneath her frantic steps. She didn't stop until she was back in the bedroom, heart hammering, lungs aching. Richard stirred, blinking groggily as she climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. "Em." His voice was thick with sleep. She didn't answer, because even as she lay there, eyes wide in the darkness, she could still feel it. Presence. Standing at the top of the stairs. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time since moving in, she felt certain of something. This house wasn't empty. It had never been. Emily barely slept. She lay still under the blankets, her breath shallow, listening to the silence of the house. It wasn't comforting. Not the kind of quiet that settles a restless mind. It was watchful. When Richard's alarm buzzed at dawn, he groaned and rolled over, rubbing his face. "You okay?" he muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Emily hesitated. She wanted to tell him, to spill everything, the voice, the painting, the presence standing at the top of the stairs. But the words felt heavy, caught somewhere in her throat. "I didn't sleep well," she said instead. Richard kissed her forehead absently before dragging himself out of bed. "I'll make coffee." She listened to him shuffle down the stairs, his footsteps pressing into the old wood. The house groaned softly, the way old houses do, but something about the sound made her stomach twist. She forced herself up. She wasn't going to let fear take root. The morning passed uneventfully. Richard worked in his study, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She stayed away from the studio. The painting was still up there, and she didn't want to look at it. Didn't want to see if it had changed again. Instead, she wandered the house, searching for something, some clue, some explanation for what was happening. It wasn't just in her head. She knew that now. In the living room, she ran her fingers along the built-in bookshelves. The previous owner had left some things behind: old novels, forgotten magazines, a few framed photographs tucked away behind stacks of yellowed pages. She pulled one free, brushing dust from the glass. A woman stared back at her. Emily frowned. She recognized the face, something about the wide eyes, the sharp lines of the jaw. The name came to her suddenly, like an echo. Shelley Duvall. She had known, vaguely, that the house had belonged to someone in the film industry. But she had never connected the dots. Not until now. Her fingers tightened around the frame. Shelley had lived here, had died here. A chill prickled the back of her neck. She glanced over her shoulder, suddenly feeling exposed. The living room stretched empty around her, morning light spilling through the high windows. But something felt off. Slowly, she turned the frame over, peeling back the faded cardboard backing. A piece of yellowed paper slipped free, folded and brittle with age. Emily unfolded it carefully. The writing was hurried, almost frantic. "It's in the walls. Watching. Waiting. I hear it at night. It knows me." Her hands trembled. She turned back to the bookshelf, digging through the forgotten remnants of the house's past. Another note. A receipt with the words, "They don't like it when you look," scrawled in the margins. A dog-eared script, the name Shelley Duvall underlined in red. A fragment of something real clicked into place inside her. This wasn't just a house. It was a stage, and someone was still here. By midday, Richard had left for town. Emily stayed behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for her to notice. Now that she had, it wasn't going to let go. She climbed the stairs, her hand brushing the banister. The wood was smooth, worn down by years of touch. For the first time, she wondered how many nights Shelley had walked these same steps, feeling the same dread curling in her stomach. The hallway stretched before her, quiet. Her studio door was closed. She didn't remember closing it. A tight knot of unease coiled in her chest. She reached for the doorknob, fingers hesitating just for a second before she turned it. The door swung open. The room smelled of paint and something else, a damp, cloying scent, like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. And then she saw it. The painting had changed again. The woman was no longer half hidden. She was standing now, fully visible, her dark eyes staring straight ahead. Straight at Emily. But that wasn't the worst part. The background had changed, too. It wasn't just the studio door anymore. It was the hallway, the stairs, the house. The painting wasn't a portrait. It was a mirror. A slow, creeping horror unfurled inside Emily as realization set in. She wasn't painting her. She was painting what she saw. And if that was true, Emily's breath hitched. The figure in the painting wasn't looking at her. She was looking past her, at something behind her. A creak. Emily turned, heart slamming against her ribs. The studio door was closing, on its own. A whisper brushed against her ear, so close she could feel the warmth of breath that wasn't there. Don't let them see you. Darkness swallowed the room as the door clicked shut. The door clicked shut. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her pulse thudding in her ears. The air in the studio thickened, pressing against her skin like damp fabric. The scent of oil paint mingled with something rotting, something wrong. She reached for the door handle, her fingers shaking. It didn't budge. Locked. No, it hadn't even had a lock before. Her throat tightened. She turned slowly, the dim light from the single window barely illuminating the room. The painting sat on the easel, the woman's figure fixed in place, her dark eyes still locked on something beyond Emily's reach. But then, a change. The paint seemed to shift, subtly, as though still wet. The woman's mouth, once closed, now hung slightly open, her lips curling into something between a whisper and a warning. The brush on the table twitched. Emily's breath hitched. No, not possible. Then, slowly, it rolled just an inch before dropping to the floor with a sharp clack. Her body went rigid. A sound followed. Not from the painting. From behind her. A low, dragging shuffle, like bare feet moving across wood. She turned so quickly that her vision blurred. The door was still closed. The window was still there. Nothing had changed. But the room was not empty. Something was in the corner. The light didn't reach it fully, but she could see the shape of something tall, something impossibly thin. Limbs that seemed too long, fingers that curled slightly at its sides, like a marionette with invisible strings. It didn't move, but it was there, watching. The air felt suffocating. The shadows along the walls pulsed, as if breathing. A faint rustling filled the space, not the wind, not the old house creaking. A voice, a whisper. She tried to leave. Emily's stomach clenched. The thing in the corner shifted just the slightest movement. A tilt of the head. A silent acknowledgement. She took a step back, her heel knocking into the easel. The painting wobbled but didn't fall. The woman's dark eyes seemed wider now, more urgent. Emily didn't want to look, but she couldn't help it. The painting had changed again. The woman's mouth was no longer parted. She was screaming, a violent, soundless wail frozen in streaks of thick, uneven brushstrokes. Her eyes too wide, too deep stared straight ahead, not at Emily, not at the house, at the thing in the room. Emily's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. No, she would not be trapped here. She spun, lunging for the door handle. It burned cold against her skin, but she yanked, throwing her weight into it. The door flew open. She stumbled into the hallway, her knees nearly buckling. The house felt wrong, now tilted, as if the very structure had warped around her fear. Something was coming. She didn't turn back, didn't check if it was following. She ran. Down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wood, breath ragged and sharp. The walls seemed narrower, closing in. The shadows along the hallway pulsed, shifting, reaching. The front door. She grasped for the handle. Cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. Emily screamed, thrashing against the grip, her skin crawling with ice. But the fingers weren't solid. They pressed against her like static, flickering, as if caught between existence and memory. She tried to leave, The whisper coiled around her, sliding into her ears, into her bones. She wrenched free, her shoulders slamming against the door as she twisted the handle. Light her. She fell onto the porch, gasping, her hands scraping against the rough wood. The morning sun burned against her skin, too bright, too real. The house loomed behind her, silent, still. But she knew it was watching. It would always be watching. Richard found her an hour later, sitting on the front steps, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't tell him everything. Not about the painting, not about the thing in the room. But she told him enough. They packed their bags that evening. Left the furniture, left the artwork, left the unfinished renovations. Left whatever was waiting inside. The house was listed again within a month. Someone else bought it, some other couple, drawn in by its charm, by its quiet history. Emily never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she swore she could still hear it. The humming, soft, low, waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.